eHarlem TV is brought to you by Mount Sinai Medical Center, Digital Laundry, and the Fresh Bread Group, and with the generous support of the Peter and Carmen Lucia Buck Foundation. Coming up, a new eHarlem TV program, Harlem Speaks, a series of conversations examining issues impacting community residents. Our subject, the 2010 census. We're going to talk politics today on eHarlem Speaks, and we've joined by some informed sources. Joining me today is Paul Taylor, Executive Director of the Pew Hispanic Center, and Walter Fields, the Executive Editor of NorthstarNews.com. Gentlemen, let's talk census numbers and what it means to our communities here in East Harlem as well as across the nation. And the first thing I want to bring up is we're losing two seats in New York by loss of population. Why is there always such a big issue about redistricting when it comes to political participation? Walter.
Well, census is a game of winners and losers in politics. There are clear winners and losers. The winners are the states that have grown in population because their representation will increase in the House of Representatives. So those states like Texas, they'll gain a few members.
Four.
Yes.
They're gaining four.
But when you look at the numbers, you can understand why. Because the House is apportioned by population. So the larger states have more representatives. New York has been losing seats, as have most northeastern states. And there are some pure political implications. And this is what I think people don't understand every 10 years when they do their census form, that guess what? It means something. It means something in terms of political representation. It also means something in terms of whether or not where you live, you might benefit from government programs that are also apportioned on population.
But isn't that the formula? The amount of people will dictate the amount of money you get into your city, your state?
Without a doubt. And there are some places that are going to lose simply because they've lost population. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to lose outright, but in our democracy, it's clear how power is apportioned in Congress. And it also translates to not only who is represented, but also seniority in terms of members in the House of Representatives. So it's a huge impact upon these communities. So losing two seats is significant for New York.
That's loss of population. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, just to add to that, it also makes a difference on who gets elected president and how we elect a president. A presidential campaign is a national popular vote, but it's really 50 separate state-based contests, and the winner of the state gets the electoral college votes from that state, which is based on the apportionment of its House of Representatives. So Texas is a bigger deal in the presidential campaign than it was 4 years ago, as are the other states in the South.
And New York is less.
And New York is less. And so the national picture changes according to these movements of people.
There still is an overwhelming number, unconscionable number of people who do not vote. I always used to take it as the Puerto Rican dilemma. In Puerto Rico, people vote above 90%. Move here, low voter participation. What's that all about, Walter?
Well, I think it's a very complex issue. I think some people vote out of sheer apathy. I think other people vote because they don't really see the return on an investment, because in politics that return is often slow. Then I think there's a segment of the population, and we see it in polls, that doesn't trust government. Whether you're black, Latino, white, there's just this
But that was always the immigrant mentality, that they came here because they didn't trust government where they were.
But I think it's higher now. In fact, this latest New York Times CBS News poll shows such a high distrust of government, the highest it's ever been in our country. And that's going to affect voting. So when you start looking at voter participation, one of the challenges has become, even with voter registration, whether or not that registration actually equates to a vote on election day. And that's always tough in all communities. So whether you can go from school board elections to city council elections to state legislative elections, congressional elections, to presidential elections, you see paltry voting in this country. More people vote for American Idol than they do for a presidential election, which says something about where we are
going on there.
Yes.
But actually, voting participation rates nationally are up. They reached a bottom about 20 years ago in the late 80s. They have been rising steadily since, and in 2008,
But is that from sheer numbers of population
No,
growth?
I'm talking about shares of people who
Okay.
vote. Shares of people who vote went from the low 50%, the shares of the voting age eligible population who voted in 1988, more than 20 years ago, that was barely over 50%. It has marched up to closer to 60%. That is an improvement, and I think some of that is, frankly, the campaign 3 years ago was a very dynamic campaign with a history-making candidate. Our politics has become angrier and more polarized over the years. That has led to, I think that's led to a lot of distrust, because we see a Washington that doesn't seem to be able to settle any problems. But it has led to some increased engagement. It's our team against their team, and we don't like them and they don't like us. Let's get out there on election day and make sure our team gets in.
But the interesting part about that, you had a revolution with the Tea Party and the Republican Party in the last election, and basically what we have is a gridlock in Congress because the Democrats want one thing, but the Republicans refuse to raise taxes in any way, and the people who are looking at this are saying to themselves, where's my interest in this? Who's representing me?
Well, there's always been gridlock in Congress. I think what we're seeing now is hyper gridlock because we've become so partisan. What we're missing in Congress right now are people in both parties who understand the importance of getting behind closed doors and sort of settling differences. That fight now is out in the open, and it doesn't seem like we have a contingent of representatives who understand that their first interest is to protect the interests of this nation, regardless of their political affiliation. But I think what you're going to see, 2008, certainly historic election. For African Americans, it was sort of a milestone moment in our development in this country. Whether or not we see that same enthusiasm in 2012 remains to be seen. I was in South Africa right after apartheid. Their first national elections, we had people sleeping on lines. That sort of fervor is hard to maintain, particularly when you go back home after a presidential election and you face the sort of historic economic downturn we've had in this country. I'm really questioning whether or not 2012 will see that same sort of euphoria in voter participation, because I think it was tied to making history and wanting change. The challenge we have in this country right now is I think a lot of people don't know where to turn. And if they don't feel that they can turn...
Is that because they don't feel that politicians are representing their best interests?
Well, I think that's where you get the high distrust of government, that when they're looking for help, they don't see any on the horizon, and people who they thought were elected to help don't seem to have answers. And that's a dangerous thing, I think, in a country of a democracy, because you want your people engaged in a way that they really do have some faith that their government is working in their best interest. So my concern over the near term and long term is, how do we reignite the American public's fervor for democratic participation, and not just at a presidential election? We have,
we have minority state and assemblymen here in East Harlem. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are people who do represent the interest, but it seems like party affiliation seems to get in the way. Any ideas about that?
Well, there's been a change nationally in party affiliation, and the growing party is the independent party. Fewer and fewer people identify themselves either as Democrats or Republicans. And I think it is tied to the sense of distrust. The whole system isn't working, and party labels just mean less in the fabric of our democracy than they used to be. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think we'll see.
Please visit us on the web at eHarlemTV.com, where you could tell us what you think about our program, as well as access any of our stories. It's new, exciting, and important. eHarlem TV. Our guest, first-term Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez.
Anything that requires public land or public dollars with respect to housing should be affordable.
8 years ago, had an East Harlem initiative to promote tourism. Did it help out?
Initially, we had some success.
Todos van a brillar como las estrellas que vemos arriba.
eHarlem TV. I always thought that Ben Wattenberg wrote kind of the definitive book on third-party movements. They basically fail.
Yeah. Well, it depends on what you define as success or failure.
Well, I'm not talking about the absorption of their issues into the main party platform. Which
that's
is-
their success,
well-
and that's the way the system works. The system is rigged against third parties. We are a two-party system. It's interesting because the founders didn't even anticipate parties, but they wrote a set of rules, and over the 200 years, those set of rules have been put in place in a way that makes it very, very difficult for third parties to get a piece of the action. And I would argue from a democratic theory point of view, that's actually pretty good. We are a very heterogeneous society. We got a lot of different interests floating around. And the idea that we force those interests at least into two parties that have to compete across a lot of interests probably is part of our political success. But it also can lead to some of the paralysis that we're seeing right now.
Walter, do you see any third-party movement that in the future that represents the interests of all of the people, minorities as well as the general population? Because I do not see it.
I have to agree. I don't think we'll see a third party. I think what we'll see are third movements. And so those movements will work hard to make sure that points on their agenda are absorbed into the political mainstream. You know, Reverend Jackson, it was the Rainbow Coalition. Now we see Occupy Wall Street, which is sort of beginning to take on forms of a political movement. It's not quite sure what it is yet, but I think in the end we will see sort of political messaging coming out of this movement.
But that movement is basically saying, well, people say they don't know what their message is, they don't know what their goals are, they don't know what their demands are. It's clear that they're talking about disparity of wealth in this country and the fact that people not having the opportunities that they should have.
But see, I think it's even more complex than that. In fact, I did an interview recently because people have been comparing Occupy Wall Street with the civil rights movement. I say that's the wrong comparison. Occupy Wall Street to me is more like the anti-war movement. It was a movement of multiple grievances. When you go back and you think about the anti-war movement, everyone thinks, oh, it was against the Vietnam War. It was really a generation speaking in America.
Civil rights, feminism, you name it.
It was so multi-layered. And I think Occupy Wall Street is like that because if you listen to the interviews on television, very rarely, except for the standard line of wealth disparity, very rarely when they start going into detail, are the grievances the same? Some people are talking about housing. Some people are talking about jobs. Some people are talking about bank fees. So there's a multi-layered. But I think in America, because of ballot access laws by individual states, third-party movements are almost impossible to get going on a national basis. But something you said earlier, I just want to touch on in terms of minority representation. The key to me is when you go back and you look at the paltry numbers of people voting in state legislative districts and city council races. So even though we have people of color representing these, very few people actually putting these people in office.
1,500, 2,000, 3,000.
It's ridiculous. So when you look at that, you have to ask yourself, is that really representation?
And there's, in terms of voting and the electorate's ability to express itself at all levels of government, the Latino community has a particular problem. To use a boxing analogy, the Latino community politically is punching below its weight. 16% of the nation is Latino. Only just under 10% of the eligible electorate is Latino. And in the last few presidential elections, only about 6 or 7% of the actual numbers of people who turn out on election day and vote are Latino. So you're 16% of the population, 6% of the voters on election day. That is a big gap. Some of that is the demographic bulge, that Latinos, a lot of Latinos aren't 18 yet, and that will start to change. Some of it is the citizenship gap. A lot of Latinos are here, they're unauthorized, and even those who are here legally, many of them are not citizens. That too will change over time. So we will see over the next generation, we will see an increase in Latino political power simply because the electoral base will start to close the gap between the overall numbers and the numbers who show up on election
Well, the
day.
question really becomes, would that actually empower them with real power to make change?
Well, real power only comes when you first vote and then you start making demands upon the system. And I think part of what we have yet to see is sort of a sophisticated politics being played in communities of color. So where are the real coalitions being built around issues of mutual interest? I think, African Americans, there's a mutual interest with the Latino community to make sure our public school systems get better. I think there's a mutual interest around economics and job opportunities. I think there's a mutual interest around political empowerment. But what we have yet to do is really build the sort of coalitions that are necessary to force political change. And in fact, New York City is almost the worst place in terms of the lack of coalition building. You saw in Chicago when Harold Washington was
I
elected.
beg to differ on a few of that, but that is one of the major issues here in New York City.
It is. I mean, when you look
Yes.
when you look at the disparity between potential and actual power, there's a real gap. There's a real dilution, and part of it's because we haven't done the work that's necessary as communities to sit around the table to say, okay, what are we going to do as a majority-minority population?
What do we need to do?
Exactly.
How do we do that? How do we organize around an agenda?
That's right. And how do we understand that simply because visibly you might gain something that we don't lose? And that's the real issue. It's sort of if we elect a Latino mayor in 4 years, is the African American community in New York City going to feel like they lost?
That would be a major issue.
It would be a huge issue.
Major issue because there's some theories about who's up next.
Right. We saw it after the Dinkins
Absolutely.
administration. We saw Freddie Ferrer, qualified, public servant. There was this issue around in the African American community. Well, I thought we were supposed to have the mayor.
You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
Welcome to eHarlem TV, a department that deals with disparities relative to minorities.
When you look at policymakers, for the most part, and talk about these issues, they just look at you.
We're not leaving until we bring everybody home. And that's what we did.
I think African Americans feel comfortable with going back to a place that their ancestors were.
That's next time on eHarlem TV.
Let me just say, as I'm thinking about this, and in the end, we're talking about the census and numbers, and there's this movement going across the country. About 38 states, I believe it is, have legislation before their legislatures that will make it more difficult to vote. Have you done any research on any of that stuff, Paul?
No, I haven't. I've followed it. I'm interested in it. It's a set of issues that has become quite partisan. Most of the motivation to make it more difficult to vote in state after state comes from Republicans and leading Democrats to believe this is a way to disempower particularly minority communities who might have more trouble with some of the new regulations, whether it's IDs or other things.
Well, I mean, I think about it, and I think about, say, Walter, I think about if somebody required a state ID for everybody, if somebody said you need a birth certificate, poor people, black people, white poor people, Hispanic poor people will all have a deterrent to the vote. It's almost going back 50 years.
Well, it goes back to, a document I have in my office of my great-grandmother's poll tax.
Exactly.
And so what you're seeing in this country, and it's particularly happening in southern states and southwestern states, where you have the large reverse migration of African Americans and large increase in Latino population, that there's this movement on to require some form of identification to prove that you are indeed a citizen, that you are indeed eligible to vote. And so you have to begin to ask the question, if voter fraud is such an issue, wasn't it an issue all the time? Why is it an issue now? Now all of a sudden we become so concerned about voter fraud. And you can go back to the 2000.
But nobody makes a voter fraud case anywhere.
Well, it's a hard case to make, but when you go back to 2000 and the debacle of the presidential election we had in 2000, I think people came out of that election two separate minds. Number one, for Democrats, we can never let this happen again. For Republicans, we can never let this happen again in terms of an increase in numbers of certain voters at the polls. So where this is all going to end up, I believe, is in the courts. Because fundamentally, the question is going to have to be answered, what qualifies you to vote in an election? And whether or not you as a United States citizen should be compelled to provide identification to prove your citizenship when it's time to vote, when that's not asked of you at any other time.
And this is all due because the populations are changing. The population shift, from north to the south and the west. I mean, Paul, it seems that we're in the midst of a changing country and that minorities ultimately would have more power, but it seems like they will always feel it's too slow.
Oh, sure. And that's part of the fabric of our history. You know, I covered city politics in Philadelphia in the 1970s, and to hear this conversation earlier about piece of the pie, blacks, Latinos, the big deal in Philadelphia urban politics in the 1970s was they elected their first Italian-American mayor, taking over from an Irish-American mayor. And you can see that story in New York, you can see that story in Boston, and that was the earlier wave of immigrants. And it's the fight over the pie, and it's the jostling, and it's the elbowing. And again, maybe I'm too much of an optimist. They're all Americans. Today's minorities are all Americans, and sure, stresses and strains along the way.
So how do we really get a message out to all communities, that the vote is important and what they need to do to ensure that they get that vote?
Well, voting participation has gone up, and I think 2008 was a very hopeful sign. It went up in a lot of communities that historically have lagged, particularly among young people. It was an historic election. The message was hope and change. I think one of the things in the short term to be nervous about is that a lot of people are pretty discouraged about the economy. A lot of people who voted for Barack Obama, frankly, who were discouraged that he hasn't done more to solve some of the problems. So whether or not we take a step backward in terms of voter participation is one of the things I think will be worth watching very closely next year. It may have an impact on the outcome of next year's election, and it may have an impact if you have a group of young voters who are sort of attracted to the system and suddenly look and say, no, it didn't really work, I didn't get hope and change. That message would be an unfortunate message for them to carry forward into their voting life and into their adult lives.
Yeah, Walter, when you look at a community like East Harlem, what are the messages that we need to send out for greater participation, a greater strategy in terms of dealing with the economy and dealing with the fact this is identified changing community?
I think the message has to be that voting is fundamental to being a citizen. You know, we just celebrated the dedication of the National Memorial for Dr. King, and if you look at his life, even after the success of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, he understood that even though that was a 14th Amendment fight for equal protection, the real fight that he had to win was on voting rights. So the next year they pushed for the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And that changed America.
That
changed the Democratic Party.
Changed America. And I think we always have to go back to the place that if you are a citizen and you are not registered to vote and voting, then you're really not a citizen because you have no voice. And it's that simple. And people need to understand that there are consequences to elections, that you can complain all you want the day after the election, but if you didn't vote on election day, guess what? You're part of the problem.
Every Father's Day, hundreds of cyclists and fans of the sport gather at the now named Marcus Garvey Park for the Skyscraper Classic. Former pro racer John Eustace is the draft day.
So the race was started in 1973 by an NYPD officer, David Walker. He was the community affairs officer of the 25th Precinct. And he was prescient. He saw that the kids didn't know how to ride bikes. It was the 70s, it was a bike boom, a lot of kids on bikes, crashing, getting hurt. So he wanted a safety program. Did the safety program, nobody paid attention to the safety program. So then he created this bicycle race. And the race was designed to attract attention to the kids' safety program. And so it's been going on for almost 40 years. This is the 38th year.
In keeping with the Skyscraper's original mission, children, many from the neighborhood, kick off the day of racing in age groups starting at 5 years old. Teens and seasoned adult club riders then take to the course on the streets surrounding the park. Meanwhile, exciting stunt demonstrations will amaze participants and spectators alike.
And what we're trying to do is make sure the Harlem community and everybody else in New York and around the world know about this race. And it's such a wonderful experience. They've come back to the race. So it's becoming world famous. And the idea is to make truly a spectacle that is going to take people's breath away. And I think later on today at 4 o'clock when the professionals take the stage, you'll all see exactly what we're talking about.
And off they go in this first race that is part of the Omnium. An Omnium, of course, familiar to most track cycling fans. A series of races held on the same day with points awarded to the winner.
We've focused on track racing specialists on the velodromes, so we've created a series of shorter, more dynamic races for them. But this racing, great, right away. People understand it, it's exciting, the sprinting, the speed, there's finishes, close finishes, elbows, great stuff. And so this is the kind of racing that will attract the American public, and that's why we're doing it. This is the only professional race in New York City, the only true race with sponsors and sanctions and television and music and noise and everything else. It's the only one. We want more kids on bikes. We want more kids in the kids' races. We want more community involvement in the race. That's key. We need more community involvement in the race. This is not my race. This is Harlem's race.
It's new, exciting, and important. eHarlem TV. Our guest, first-term Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez.
Anything that requires public land or public dollars with respect to housing should be affordable.
8 years ago, had an East Harlem initiative to promote tourism. Did it help out?
Initially, we had some success.
Todos van a brillar como las estrellas que vemos arriba.
eHarlem TV. Walter, Paul, fascinating discussion, messages, get out and vote, also be counted. Thank you for joining us on eHarlem Speaks.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Way to go, way to go. eHarlem TV is brought to you by Mount Sinai Medical Center, Digital Laundry, and the Fresh Bread Group, and with the generous support of the Peter and Carmen Lucia Buck Foundation.